at the close of the 90s, I was dying for some good horror. I mean, I'd enjoyed the highbrow literary adaptations, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. I'd liked the film version of Interview with a Vampire. But I was dying for something that would genuinely scare me and not just feel a little gothic, a little dark. And in 1999, was watching every horror movie that was coming out. And there were two films in '99 that stood out that as sort of markers for where at least the beginning of the 2000s would go in some respects. Starting with Bruce Willis's appearance in M. Night Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense, which had this Hitchcockian surprise ending, had some genuine scares along the way, and was just a great, creepy ghost story. And its success arguably paved the way for a number of other great haunted movies, great ghost stories. And when I reached the point in this course where I was looking at the 2000s, I realized I've looked at every other major type of monster except for the ghost. So, which ghost should I include in the films that I could, ascertain as the great ones from the 2000s? One of the standouts was, of course, Guillermo del Toro's The Devil's Backbone, which is an absolutely brilliant piece of cinema. Beautiful movie, wonderful story. It's great in every way possible. And if you can get your hands on the Criterion Collection version of it, I highly recommend you do so. And then there was the not rated R, not super gory, not utterly terrifying, but still genuinely creepy, The Others with Nicole Kidman. A great ghost story. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And then, of course, there was the option to go with Paranormal Activity, the indie film of all indie films in terms of horror movies, a movie that made so much money at the box office that it stands as one of the great success stories of indie filmmaking. And, of course, Paranormal Activity was indicative of one of the other directions that one could go in looking at horror in the 2000s, and that's found footage films. Starting with the Blair Witch Project, which was a bit of a sensation when it first came out, although I totally agree with a friend of mine who said, I think this film would have been more terrifying if I'd found the VHS tape of it in my garbage, if it was in my trash or something like that. It would have been an interesting marketing campaign. But it was the story of student filmmakers, and that is something that gets repeated with some later found footage movies, disappearing in the woods near Burkittsville, Maryland, while shooting a documentary. A year later, their footage was found. And like so many horror films before, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Blair Witch Project capitalized on the possibility that this was based on a true story. And the film certainly felt that way, seeing it in the theater. There's no soundtrack to guide your emotional landscape. You just have the images to deal with. But its success spawned a number of other found footage movies, including Wreck, right? Record. The giant monster film, Cloverfield. We didn't know it was a giant monster film when it was first being released. It was one of those J.J. Abrams trying to keep us on the edge of our seats and make us wonder whatever mystery are you cooking up for us now, the man who gave us Lost. It's another found footage film. I think it's really, really well done. I don't particularly necessarily enjoy found footage movies. I don't find them as cinematically compelling as some other films, although the more that I think about it, the more I think there's really an art to making it feel like you're watching a piece of film that was made by students, but doesn't make you sick, gives you a compelling storyline, and it's one of the things that I think is so great about the Norwegian film Troll Hunter, which isn't super scary horror, but is still horror nonetheless. There's some horrible things that happen in the narrative, and its trolls are certainly horrific in a way. But that narrative holds together even while the film has to continue to keep up the pretense of being this, student film, this object that you just find. And then of course we come full circle to Paranormal Activity, and so it just seems like, gosh, you got to go with Paranormal Activity. But ultimately, I decided not to. And it's not because I don't think Paranormal Activity is a scary film, because I think it is. I think it's terrifying. And there are ways in which we could study it. But I thought that there would be something richer, I guess, in the discussion of looking at a different sort of found footage movie. And that's a movie where in the found footage is inside the diegesis, the fictional world of the film, not the style in which the film is made. And that it would also be emblematic of what Murray Leader says, in the 1990s, there was this full cycle of Japanese horror, often shortened and genericized to J-horror. And this became a major international force to be reckoned with a slate of daring, serious, and disturbing films. J-horror, which, some horror historians will go, it was a flash in the pan. But really, J-horror is Japanese horror. And certainly the remakes, and this is something Leader talks about, the remakes of movies like Ringu being made into The Ring, or Ju-on being made into The Grudge, is indicative of a very sort of narrow idea of what J-horror ultimately is. And Leader says, if you think that J-horror is just what we got in these remakes, well, let me tell you, there's a lot of other stuff that you're missing out on. Right off the top of my head, I think of, it's not necessarily horror in the sense, although it is certainly filled with horrific imagery, a movie like Battle Royale, which Leader also cites. When I went to prepare for this lecture, I found myself in a situation unique from the other lectures that I've given and the ones that I have yet to give, in that there wasn't really any sustained secondary literature around this movie. There have been a number of academic conversations between Ringu and The Ring, and then other, the Korean remake, but there wasn't one that looked specifically at Verbinski's The Ring and sort of treated it on its own merit. And that's something that I'd like to do, in as much as I want to go yes, of course I wanted to highlight that there was J-horror and it was this moment in American film, but this entire course has really been horror in English, aside from the start with Nosferatu. I mean, maybe it's a bit disingenuous for me to say this, but it was my way of getting 100 years of horror into the course. But the majority of the films have been in English and made primarily by American filmmakers, with a few, jumps over the pond to Britain, if you count the making of, because James Whale was British, that The Bride of Frankenstein is ultimately a British film, but is made in America. But to avoid having the wealth of world cinema that you get by turning your gaze outside of the United States and outside of English-speaking countries, I had to refine the course. And the moment you open up the gates to French horror, to Japanese horror, things get bananas, and it gets very, very hard to make decent decisions about which films you'll include. And it also becomes increasingly difficult to teach that content without having this huge foundation of cultural signifiers in place. Valerie Wee, in her article Visual Aesthetics and Ways of Seeing, comparing Ringu to The Ring, comments on how the very images that are found on the cursed videotape in both films say something about the cultures that produce them. And it's one of the reasons that it can be really difficult to teach things like traditional haiku, because if you don't have the symbolic, you don't have the awareness of what these symbolic signifiers mean, then you're at a loss to say what you think that particular haiku is about. Like, does a Westerner really understand the significance of, some form of water bird like a crane standing as a storm rolls in? That kind of thing matters. And it's also ultimately why I wanted to focus on Verbinski's The Ring, because I'm not someone who studies East Asian narrative enough or culture enough to be an expert in that respect. Kaiju movies, totally different thing. I have I have enough information for that, but this is not that thing. What was really frustrating for me as I was, as again, as I say, I was preparing for this and I'm trying to find secondary sources, not because I can't think stuff up on my own, but because I subscribe to Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein's approach of writing research essays, but I've also worked that into my own research of understanding that we are always entering a conversation that it already exists and is ongoing when we do research, and that to ignore that conversation, like we do that at our peril. And so I at least wanted to enter the conversation a little bit. But as I say, there isn't a lot of academic conversation around Verbinski's The Ring on its own. What I saw a lot of was, these comparative things where there was always a sense of like the original was better, that priority mattered in some way, or that there was something more essentially true or valuable or authentic about the Japanese version. So, Colette Balmain's Oriental Nightmares, the demonic other in contemporary American adaptations of Japanese horror film, says, through the process of adaptation, the narratives of both films were reworked within the conventions of mainstream Hollywood narrative. Speaking of The Ring and another J-horror film, Hollywood narrative, with the psychological horror of the originals being replaced in places by greater emphasis on more immediate visceral thrills of the spectacle. And I don't know, that just feels like it's like somehow the spectacle or whatever it was that someone, that Verbinski did in The Ring wasn't as valuable. And I suppose, depending on what you're wanting to do, I mean, Balmain's focus is the demonic other in contemporary American adaptations of Japanese horror film. She's really looking at Orientalism and the way in which the other is represented in horror. I suppose that works then to approach it in that way. But my approach has been throughout this course to look at horror to some degree within its cultural context, to be sure, but always within a sense of the formal art of film language and the way in which that constructs moments in cinema that produce Hainich's different modes of fear, these different, like what produces direct horror, suggestive horror. How is it used in this particular film? How does the camera work contribute to that? How does the sound work with that? What does the mise en scène tell us about what this film is trying to do? And is that part of what horrifies us? Because, referencing once again Andrew Tudor's idea that we have to ask the question, why this horror for these people in this place at this time? That isn't always a cultural question. Sometimes that has an awful lot to do with the technological innovations that were available to the filmmaker to enhance their expression of horror in this particular instance. And then the other thing that I kept seeing in the literature that I was looking at was readings of the film that to me didn't really speak to the film as horror film so much as some sort of cultural artifact that's, again, speaks to the deep-seated horror that we are repressing. So here is Brian Jarvis's anamorphic allegory in The Ring, or 7 Ways of Looking at a Horror Video. Samara has been read as an allegorical emblem. So this is one that looks particularly at Verbinski's film in particular. But Samara has been read as an allegorical emblem for the history of ghost machines and for contemporary optical technologies. Now listen to that. An allegorical emblem for the history of ghost machines, that I sort of get, and for contemporary optical technologies. But she also appears as a Gothic premonition of an imminent digital zeitgeist. a Sibylline specter from the post-celluloid future. As this digital wraith crawls through the screen, we could be witnessing the allegorical death of analog, video, and celluloid film alongside the figurative birth of next-generation virtual reality. And I'm thinking, do you really think? I mean, that's an interest. It sort of becomes the reading for the sake of the reading. And, if that's your jam, carry on. But in understanding what this film is doing, that makes me scared. The thing that produces, one of Hainich's modes of fear. This doesn't really work for me. It's like, oh no, the loss of VHS tape. Whatever will we do, Margaret? Like, it just doesn't feel to me like we're talking about the text. It always feels like we're using the text as a way to talk about other things that we're interested in talking about. And at that point, I'm just like, go and talk about it. Like, just go and talk about that thing. But stop doing this. Not that I really think Brian Jarvis should necessarily, but I guess for me, I'm probably getting read a bit. It probably triggers me a little bit, and I don't really want to use that word because I think real triggering and PTSD are, that's serious stuff. But like it hits me in a place that brings up a lot of emotions related to my career when I was a minister, because I would often appropriate narratives allegorically to use as devotional content. Let me give you an example of how, Jesus does whatever. And I would use some moment from a film to illustrate that. And it was almost always allegorizing. And I don't know that I think I was doing something wrong, but I was certainly reinterpreting films in ways they weren't meant to be understood. I was constantly appropriating them for what I was interested in saying. And so as an academic, I'm always a little bit, I get itchy when I read that sort of thing, because like what I was doing as a minister was I was taking the film and I was going, I don't want to talk about what you're talking about, so I'll bring you over here and make you do what I want you to. And I always feel like, it does a little bit of violence to the text at some level. More of Brian Jarvis. Samara's emergence from these machines signifies a terrifying materialization of all that which lies buried and unseen beneath the postmodern image. The vast infrastructure of production, distribution, and maintenance which sustains post-industrial networks of reproduction. No. I'll give Jarvis the last one. Nope. I don't think this film is about the vast infrastructure of production, distribution, and maintenance which sustains post-industrial networks of reproduction. So it feels like a book. There was a book that I read when I was when I was a minister, and it was called Adventures in Missing the Point. And I felt an awful lot as I was looking through the literature surrounding Verbinski's The Ring that I was inside of a new version of that this was like Adventures in Missing the Point with The Ring. So now that I've done a whole bunch of talking about what, I don't agree with, let me give you my reading, because that's ultimately all I've got for you today. I don't have other people to quote. I don't have a lot of other people to cite. I have only my crazy Mike Pershawn observations to present to you. So here we go. The film opens in much the same way we would say as Scream opened. The last film that we looked at. Scream opens with the lone teen female in the house. We get two of them this time, but it sure feels like familiar territory. It feels like standard slasher territory. And I do want to highlight that I think that you've got a shift where, if the 90s were about were the decade of the serial killer, there was a moment at the beginning of the 2000s where there was a shift over to supernatural horror, and The Ring was one of these moments. But it's still utilizing, and I realize, of course, that this film relies deeply upon its source text. It is a remake of Ringu, and insofar as the story elements are concerned, it follows them closely. But there's a lot of aesthetic and stylistic moves that Verbinski makes that are distinct from that film. But I don't want to play a game of which one's better, because they're both great movies. I don't want to jump back and forth going, and this one does this and the other one does that. I mean, I'm going to do that probably twice. But I mostly want to take The Ring as its own film rather than as comparative node with Ringu, because there are some things to be discerned and discovered in that kind of comparative work. Valerie Wee's already done it. So go check out her article, Visual Aesthetics and Ways of Seeing, Comparing Ringo to the Ring, and you will learn some stuff in that respect. I do not want to engage in a comparative read of these movies, but rather a close, formal read of Verbinski's The Ring. So, the standard setup with the teenagers, and then they're talking about an urban myth involving a videotape that if you watch it, 7 days later you die. And this is familiar ground. Did you ever hear the story about the lone babysitter in the house, and then she phones and the guy's upstairs, and we get that recycled over and over again. So the film begins someplace that feels terribly familiar, but moves off that territory relatively quickly. Although we get another Scream-esque fake out right away with, the one girl pretending to choke. Something that will later be made good upon when our heroine has to drag the contact out of her mouth, and it almost looks like she's bringing up hair initially, but that choking is something that pays off later in the film. But here it's just a fake out. Here it's, oh, I'm dying. And the actress does a very good job here of selling us on this being the beginning of whatever it is that's about to happen. Whatever she's doing, this is it. It's going down. And then she collapses onto her friend's lap, and there's that shock, and oh, you jerk, I can't believe you did that to me. And we get that first fake out. And this opening sequence is full of fake outs. So, Katie and her friend going downstairs, and we get the first of many shots the opening sequence of this film is like, here's the catalog of all the types of shots that we're going to use in this film, and we're going to hit those notes over and over and over again. We're just going to keep coming back to them. And so we get, Katie and her friend going downstairs, and the aperture, through which we see them, is very narrow. And there are a lot of confined spaces in this film. The mise-en-scène of this film is, can we find locations where we'll have to crowd the actors in? There are a few wide shots. There are a few sprawling drive-through, the Seattle wilderness kind of shots. But there are a lot of look down the narrow hallway shots. And this is one of the first of many. It's also one of the first of many moments of rack focus. This film uses so much rack focus. So rack focus is when you have a change in point of focus for one subject to another in the same shot. So in this one, it begins with Katie and her friend, and the phone is out of focus in the foreground. And then as they come closer, the phone comes into focus, and what's in the back goes out of focus. And rack focus is used to it's used to move, it's to draw our eye, to focus our eye, to create what we call eye tracing, to make sure that we're looking where we need to. But when you leave background sections out of focus, there are also spaces in which traditionally you can hide the monster, you can hide the threat, you can hide the face at the window. And so the use of rack focus over and over again creates a little bit of a sense of dread that builds until we get some form of that shock resolution, right? And we get another fake out here as Katie's friend picks up the phone, and and she hands it over. She doesn't say it's your mom. She just hands it over, and then we get the reveal. But boy, I'll tell you, they stretch that out. Verbinski plays it out as long as he can. Again, building dread. And what's great about this is it's like dread, ah, dread, ah. And so now that we've been toyed with twice, we're in the mode of like, how many more of these fake outs are we going to get? And I love the shot where the camera pushes towards Katie filling a glass, of lemonade. And in the background, we can see these frosted windows that you can't see through perfectly. And that's something else that we see a lot of in this film, are surfaces that are impermeable. Like, we can't see through them clearly. They're not, it's not clear glass. It's like it's frosted glass, or there's rain on the window or something like that. And so the camera's pushing in, and we've got the same kind of setups that we saw at the beginning of Scream, with Casey, Drew Barrymore playing Casey as she walks around this house, where there's like, how many windows do you people have? Whenever I ride past houses that have that many windows, I'm always like, man, that just looks like a lot of trouble with blinds, because I don't want people looking in my house. That freaks me out. But for a horror movie, it's perfect, right? Because then you can have somebody looking through the window. Great choices for mise-en-scène. The mise-en-scène here is really, really well done, not only because of the windows, but also his color scheme, which we'll get to in just a little bit. It's very, very consistent, not only color grading, but color scheme in the way that this film has been designed at the level of set and costume. It's cold, right? It's like being in the Matrix. And the camera pushes forward, and we are waiting for something to happen, because this is that thing where, almost in the way that found footage films work, where you're pushing forward as the first person perspective. Are we the killer? Is the killer about to go into the room? No, in fact, the monster, as it were, the threat that looms, is in the background with the television, the light from the television coming through that glass, that frosted glass. And the look on the actress's face, this look of shock. She goes in, she shuts it off. She's yelling for her friend, quit screwing around. And then there's the moment of the ascent back upstairs, still looking for her friend. And now we get one of many narrow staircases that we're going to get. And as I said before, we get repetitions of these things. When Aiden, is the young boy, Rachel's son, is at the funeral, and he's looking up the stairs. This is the same perspective. And so there's a sense of not only intertextual echoes or intermedial echoes with other films that we've looked at this semester, but the film has its own sort of echo chamber within its narrative, where this has happened and now it's happening again. And there are these recurrences, these visual motifs. And in some way, it's sort of, there's a way in which it echoes The Thing, and I'll say more about this in just a little while, but in that what is happening now has happened before. But we're seeing it. We get that same kind of setup that we get with Scream, which is we need to kill someone at the beginning of this film so that we can tell you how dire this is. And we are going to see this yet again with It Follows. So, repetition of that narrow staircase. And again, mise-en-scène, production design, choice of, if, shooting on location, find me a house with narrow staircases. Find me a space with narrow staircases. And we get so many narrow staircases, so many shots, including the ladder shots that move up in that way. And then lots, again, of narrow hallway shots. Katie looking down towards her bedroom as inexplicably and mysteriously water just pours out. And I get the chills every time I watch this sequence with that that move to that tritone, moves up through a sequence that resolves into this moment of dissonance. It always gives us a sense of the creeps. It's just great. But all we have here is water on the floor, and yet it's terrifying because of the way in which Verbinski is filming all of these things. And that narrow hallway is just like, is there anywhere else you can go? No, there's a sense of being hemmed in. There's a sense of being confined. And this film is a catalog of shots in what we call closed framing. Closed framing making the film goer feel like the character in the movie, and that they lack agency. They are hemmed in. They are trapped. All of this, of course, being consistent with the film's narrative thrust. Again, Aiden, this exact shot to some degree, it's not quite as low. We don't have to see the water on the floor, but it's a very similar shot when he walks upstairs to see Katie's room. She was his babysitter. They were very close. They were cousins. And so he's lamenting that loss, and he's taking the same journey that she does, which in some ways anticipates that it will be him who will as well be the subject of this has happened before, now it's happening again. Now, in addition to the repetition of confined, closed framing, we get a ton of frames within frames. This movie is chock full of, okay, here's your frame of the cinema. This is this is the frame in which we've shot this, and then inside the frame there's another frame, and it's usually showing you some more cinema. There are other images, but we get to see the movie within the movie over and over again, and it's legit found footage. I mean, I'm poking fun at that a little bit. But I felt like that was a way to sort of playfully say, oh, I did both. I did J-horror and found footage in one film. Of course, realizing that I didn't. But some of that idea that my friend had said, can you imagine if they'd have marketed Blair Witch Project by just, randomly putting VHS tapes in people's trash, and then you would, or somewhere where they would find it in their mailbox or whatever, and you find this tape and you're like, what the hell is this? And you put it in and it's like, what am I watching? What kind of they could have done the same thing with The Ring. It would have been absolutely terrifying. I was genuinely freaked out when I saw this movie. I didn't see it in the theaters. I saw it on DVD. And on the DVD, they've got this option that says, don't watch this. It's the Ring video. It's Samara's projections. And, I'm a rational human being, or I like to think I am. I knew I wasn't watching a videotape, so, I'm fine, right? I don't know. It was just so incredibly disturbing. I'm going to say more about why I think it's disturbing in just a little bit. We get these frames within the frames of Samara's, nightmarish visions on the television. And then within those frames, we often get static. And this is another recurrence. So I'm talking about the things that I see over and over again. Where do we see the visual motifs? Where do we see what this film is doing over and over again? And this goes back to the color scheme of this film to some degree, but static itself. And here I'm quoting Craig Rain, the poet Craig Rain, in his poem, A Martian Sends a Postcard Home, in which an alien is describing Earth. And when the alien describes rain, he says that rain is the color of TV turned to a dead channel. Rain is the color of TV turned to a dead channel. And it makes me think of William Gibson's line where he says that the sky was the color of television. Again, turned to a dead channel. Maybe I'm mixing those actually a little bit. But anyway, rain is the color of television, I think is what it says. Rain is when the world is the color of television, or something like that. And William Gibson says the thing about TV turned to a dead channel. Both making the reference that rain falling looks a lot like static. And sure, you could say, well, the movie was filmed in Seattle. That's why there's so much rain. No. That's ignoring the depth of contrivance that movies are produced with, especially once we recognize, as we can with The Ring, that this film is being made as carefully as it is. We ought to acknowledge that other aspects of the film were probably made with as much care. Now, if it was Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it was the Seattle Chainsaw Massacre, and you were like, it rains a lot in this movie, you'd be like, well, it's because it was low budget and they couldn't go anywhere else, and well, Seattle's always raining, so low budget now. But Verbinski's The Ring, not a low budget picture. There was money involved with this film. They could have filmed it somewhere else, but they filmed it in Seattle. I think there are reasons for that, and the rain is probably part of it. But not just, we wanted to go somewhere there was rain, but rain as a recurrence of almost like nature's static, as it were, that this film is constantly in opaque state. that we don't always see clearly what's going on. This film is all about not seeing clearly, in as much as it's about seeing. It's about surfaces. It's about, the rain on the surface and staring out. It's about people being reflected in windows. Aiden being reflected in the television screen in his cousin's room. So we get those recurrences. And then we get the evidence, the clues that point us to the truth about what's going on. And this brings us back to the frames within frames. Although now we're not talking about frames within frames where the frame has a moving picture in this particular case, but rather Katie's scrapbook, which is filled with photos which are ultimately still frames. They're, images within the image. And we get, these images from fashion magazines where she's scribbled with a black marker, hair falling over the face being obscured. Again, the obscuring, the opacity, the ability to see clearly, what's going on. The frame of Katie herself in the photographs that Rachel goes through, resolving into that creepy photo with the smudged faces, which will itself be a recurrence. But those are mediated to us as frames within frames. And Rachel's eyes become the windows through which we see these things. Although later on, it will be, Aiden's father, her former lover, Rachel's former lover, who have who becomes our other set of eyes, in as much as the camera is constantly our narrator. But we're seeing, and this is where I really want to push back against sort of that, it's about the loss of analog technology and the rise of the digital. And it's like, no, this film is just using all the technologies. There's so many different forms of media that lead Rachel to the truth. So much so that I had to think, wow, this feels like, if you've ever played the role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, it felt like a Call of Cthulhu adventure where you're constantly being given handouts. The guy who's running the game is like, read another handout. Here's some more reading for you. And you read it and you go, ooh, creepy clue. And the clue always leads you to the next thing. And when you get there, guess what you get? More clues, right? So every piece of media that Rachel discovers, these frames within the frames, which then become framed themselves, and you might say, well, aren't all sorts of films like this one? Yes, there's always a frame around the movie that you're watching, but is what's happening in the mise en scène? Is it filled with frames? Is it filled with confined spaces? But this film doesn't just make use of old books and old microfiche of newspaper articles. It also makes use of the internet. So the digital is also there. I don't think this film is about, it's about those technologies. It's about media technology insofar as they are in the film. But that's a little bit like saying that James Cameron's Titanic is an indictment of, shipbuilding at the beginning of the 20th century. Missing the point. It's a disaster film crossed with a romance, and this is a horror movie. It's not a film that has something to say about the way in which we receive media. This is not The Social Network, and we get images as well of children's art. Both teenager and then Aiden's really creepy drawing of the family, and there's appears to be Samara hanging around with them as well. Really seemingly benign frames on the wall. The film does not need to include these things, but the film does. And if a film carefully includes objects like this in its mise en scène, they are as crucial to the storytelling as any other aspect of film that we would be looking at. We get these moments of projected thermography, right? These images that the ex-boyfriend finds at the and that too being a scene that has a confined nature to it, as we'll see. And then the videotape that Rachel watches is just frames within frames within frames. It gets very sort of infinite regressions kind of going on, where we have a TV. Well, we have our frame, then we have the TV within the frame, and then we have one of those projected thermographic images, and then we have a video screen in the video screen of Samara, and Samara in the background. So it's just layer upon layer upon layer. And people can talk all they want about the postmodern significance of these things, the simulacra and the simulacrum and all sorts of other, ways in which you might read this. But I think that all of these things add up to a sense of confinement, a sense of being hemmed in. We're going to come back to that in just a second, because this film crosscuts between these really tight, closed spaces and these wide open ones that just show up out of the blue like a non sequitur. And you're like, what? And it's one of the things I love about this movie. Apparently, they wanted David Lynch to do it, but he wasn't available or something. David Lynch couldn't do the movie. But boy, oh boy, does this movie ever feel Lynchian. It's so many points like a David Lynch movie. Not least because it's filmed out in the Seattle area, which was the same place that Twin Peaks was filmed. So there's a very strong association with, in my mind anyway, with David Lynch and that area of the world, no matter, how much he was involved or not involved in the second season of the television series. That was me being very digressive. My apologies. Bring it back around. This, the solitary lone tree. I don't know why I said solitary and lone. Could I be more redundant? Solitary tree with these red leaves on it, with the sun behind it and the clouds moving, and it's often done with a little bit of time lapse speed to it, and it's creepy. It comes out of the blue. It's like watching a nightmare. It's like watching a dream. So much dream imagery in this film, even when most of the time nobody's dreaming. Close-ups of those red leaves. And these shots get repeated at points in the film where they don't seem to have any narrative sense. And they're very jarring. They tend to be, disturbing, despite the fact that there's nothing disturbing about these photos. I mean, really, they're kind of pretty. But what it allows Verbinski to do is to fill the cabin that Rachel is in, getting more evidence, more clues. In her Call of Cthulhu adventure, Rachel goes out to a creepy cabin in the woods and, finds another clue. And she watches the clue, which of course means that she's going to die in 7 days. But before she does, the room fills with red light. Now, that makes no sense in the real world. You don't care how many leaves you run the sun's light through, you will not get that kind of red light. The only way you get that kind of red light is if you have a red gel over a light. That's how you get that light, or you use actual colored lights. And some of the critical responses to this film were like, it's incoherent, it doesn't make sense. But it sure works in a creepy way. Like the moment that room starts to go red, I'm like, I have the same reaction that the guy did sitting in front of me watching The Thing when the blanket moved and you knew the thing underneath wasn't dead. And he said, oh, goddamn. And, like he's worried about what's going to happen next. That's me. When Rachel sits on that couch and she's looking at the videotape and the room starts to go red. And that feels very Lynch as well, because he had his red room in Twin Peaks. So maybe it's not Lynch so much as Twin Peaks that this echoes for me. But it makes me, this is the moment that I feel like it's worth quoting Valerie Wee again. I referenced her earlier. I'm going to quote her directly now. She says, Japanese cinema reveals a tendency. And okay, this isn't Japanese cinema. I get that. This is Gore Verbinski. But it's Verbinski riffing on a Japanese film. Japanese cinema reveals a tendency to eschew realism in preference of its own aesthetic commitment to the presentational aspect of art. Its own aesthetic commitment to the presentational aspect of art, where stylization and artifice are emphasized and valued, and where the non-rational and suggestive are accepted and valued over the literal. Alongside this privileging of art and artifice, was an accompanying neglect of narrative coherence. An accompanying neglect of narrative coherence. So some people say, well, it just doesn't make any sense, because if you stop to think about it, you stopped to think about it? Why would you ever stop to think about it in a horror movie? That's not what you're supposed to be doing. I mean, if that's the way you want to enjoy your movies, more power to you. But The Ring works because The Ring feels like a dream. It feels strange and weird and unsettling, and it doesn't make sense. It doesn't. You just say, none of this makes sense, but that sounds like a line from a horror movie. None of what's happening here makes sense, right? But it doesn't have to, because working out of this tradition, and this is really, I think, Verbinski being more in the tradition that Valerie Wee is talking about than he is within the Hollywood tradition. In the same way that Lynch has sat outside of it so much, and that the writer and sort of creator of Twin Peaks, Mark Lynch once, or no, not Mark Lynch, Mark Frost once said about David Lynch, David can't do narrative worth shit, but he can make you feel things. Just through pure cinema. I mean, that's something that Lynch does from time to time. I think he just did pure cinema. Here's a bunch of images on the screen. Now feel what I want you to. And I think Verbinski is successful in The Ring in making us feel a sense of dread by aligning these images in this way. And he's playing with reality in a way that feels verisimilar, but it's not perfect. And then we get another one of those these non sequiturs work throughout the film. They just boonk out of the blue. Let me give you a close-up of a horse's eye. Now, if you took that from 20 feet back, totally different shot, but you get right up there, and boy, that's disturbing as all get out. And it's this prefiguring of what is about to happen, of the horse who is hemmed in, who is confined, breaking free. And once having broke free, is he like, he's not like, let it go. No, he's like, I'm just going to jump over the side of this ship and die horribly so that the little girl who owned me can scream. And you can see blood in the ocean, an image that we've seen in Samara's, visions that she projects through the videotape. But it's this sudden intrusion of the seemingly non sequitur imagery rendered in this color scheme. Again, coming back to the color scheme, that grainy, vintage feeling footage. It's not sepia, but it's monochromatic, and so it feels old timey, and it's got that sort of flicker to it that tells us like there's something old and there's something from the past about this. And that is a difference between the way that Verbinski handles that and the way that the original Ringu handles that, because we don't get that same kind of use of the color scheme of the video throughout the film. Like, we get repetition of that in the mise en scène of production design, of costuming, of the rainy, digital color grading of the movie. The images within the tape, of course, are also about confinement. The top of the well itself, we get the mother in the frame. We also get Samara in a frame. We get the father upstairs in the house, framed by the window. Frame. And trust me, go back and watch the movie again. You're going to be like, oh my God, this is everywhere. And remember that it's not like they're just like walking around going, well, I guess we'll film here. Some location scout went out and decided this is where we're going to shoot this to reinforce all of these motifs, these ideas. And you get when you finally get a wide shot like Rachel running out of the cabin, it's not meant to go and she's free. We have the same sense of the horse dying. Yeah, it broke free, but it's not off the ship, and it's going to die horribly. And there's a little bit of, well, Rachel's out of the cabin, but we know she's still confined. She's still closed in. She's still hemmed in. Everything is still dangerous. And the film's visual motifs continue to reinforce this, with her standing at the bottom of that ladder and the camera looking down at us. The use of the repetition of the non-diegetic words on the screen, Saturday, day 3, right? The countdown that tells us how much more time she has, the narrow confines of hallways within mental wards and within people's houses, the closed framing of sitting Naomi Watts right in the middle of a room that is just packed with old newspapers, and that, you know, creates this sense of closed in, of things, you know, confining you. The film also makes very wide use of masking, which is a technique where you block off portions of the frame, which creates new frames. And we've sort of talked about this a little bit, but that wasn't really that wasn't masking in those particular cases. But here, what you're doing is you've got, like, when Rachel is going down in the elevator and she's looking up through the slats, and she's masked. That's what we refer to as masking. And that creates new frames within the standard rectangle of the film. The shot when Rachel is speaking to the doctor on the island is masked by the playground merry-go-round as the boy is on it, and we keep having our vision obscured. The tree in the middle of that yard, this giant tree. Why did they film there? Well, because they could mask with several of the items in the space. And this again, it's a visual motif that recurs throughout the film, and it creates this sense of things being blocked in, hemmed in, trapped, right? When Noah has gone to the archives and the camera is following in the aisle next. Did the camera have to do that? No. You could just follow the actor or have the camera in front of the actor, and that creates a different effect. But this movie over and over again is trying to go, let me put you in a little box, or a well, as it were. When Noah and Rachel finally come to the climax of the quest, discovering, you know, what's going on in the barn, the shots of them entering the barn have that sense of small enclosed spaces. Samara's room at the top of the ladder, I get chills every time I look at that shot, that scene. It always just gives me the creeps, in some ways maybe because it's now reminding me of Hereditary. But the ladder, you know, there's this sort of these payoffs, but they're not just payoffs in terms of like that ladder as motif. It's how it sits within the frame. That room up at the top of that ladder is this narrow little space. There's a narrow little ladder going up to that narrow little space, and the camera tracks Rachel's ascent not from the side or from behind her, but rather from the other side of the ladder, so that as she climbs, you guessed it, we've got these frames that hem her in. When they finally hack through the floor of the cabin, where is the shot positioned? The camera is down inside the hole, looking out at Noah and Rachel, giving us yet again a jagged one, but frame nonetheless. So over and over again, this movie has this sense of closing in on us, and we feel that intuitively, even if we don't recognize it immediately. We certainly feel that when Rachel falls down the well and the well cap, you know, is closing. We feel that sense of claustrophobia, of, oh no, she's trapped. But that is consequently why the film is able to fake us out so well at the end. Because after this inundation of all these closed frames, of the masking, of the frames within the frames, we get this shot where Rachel is holding Samara's skeletal corpse, looking up towards the light, and that light signals freedom. Just the way that shot is presented, there's just something, I hate using the word iconic, but I'm going to use it anyway. Something iconic about that. It just looks like, oh, we've got the moment of hope. All is well. Light is shining down. She's clearly no longer confined in the darkness. All will be well, and all manner of things will be well. And the very next shot is a wide pan. The camera looking initially to the right, seeing a police vehicle drive up, and then a very wide pan that takes us across all of the emergency, operate all these people, these emergency staff who've showed up to, excavate the cabin, do whatever it is that these people do, forensic stuff. And the camera keeps panning over until finally it arrives at Noah and Rachel over at this log. And again, we're in the middle of the woods, ostensibly the woods just outside of Seattle, or, maybe Vancouver. I'm not sure where they filmed it. But there's lots of opportunities for masking here. But the camera's not doing that now. It's not really hemming them in. It's actually, this feels very wide and open, which is exactly the sort of shot you'd want to have if this was where the movie ended. But it's not, as we know. But the movie fakes us out at this point through these technical moves. The only masked shot that we get in this sequence following is of Noah and Rachel's hands as they hold hands together. And we know everything's good now. Everything is good. And that is mirrored in the performance the young actor who plays Aiden as he opens his eyes and he smiles, not too much. It's not an 80s family movie, but he just smiles a little bit. And we go, oh, it's okay. The music tells us it's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. And I think it's why it's so great that it's Aiden who gets to tell us that it's not. Because Aiden just told us it was. Aiden, you liar. And we get to him saying, Rachel, you weren't supposed to help him. You weren't supposed to help her. This is the most terrifying scenes for me in, I gotta say, the history of horror. This scene always gives me chills. But I'll readily admit, supernatural horror, that's my jam. So it's gonna hit me harder probably than other types. When he says that, I just, the chills. And then his nose starts to bleed and you're like, no. And the movie moves back to its frequent techniques. Frames within frames. Part of Noah's studio, masking the television initially so that we don't see it perfectly right away. But again, frame within frame, closed situations. And this too is very distinct from Ringu in that we have that grainy, monochromatic, feels like a silent film, feels like Nosferatu. Let's be real here. But just with a little demon girl who, can't keep her hair out of her eyes. And then when she crawls out of the television screen, just the corpse-like nature of this creature, absolutely fabulous. I've seen some critiques of Verbinski's The Ring that says that it doesn't feel as real, consequently, as Ringu does. I don't know about that. I mean, willing suspension of disbelief, being the sympathetic viewer, I think this absolutely works. It scared the ever-living shit out of me the first time that I saw it. I love this film. I'll just come right out and say. And again, we get another echo in that we've got the monstrous child. This is in some ways a callback, I think, to The Exorcist, that Samara is in this form like possessed Regan. And it's great because we got Samara as normal child, and the movie played us. Oh, the movie played us. It gave us this beautiful little child, and it made us think that the parents were the monsters, those monstrous parents. And then it revealed bits and pieces that we hadn't been given it all yet. We hadn't been given all the information. When we were given all the information, then we understand who the real monster is. And it's that motiveless malice again. We don't know why. We don't know why Samara's like this, but she is. And she's terrifying. Right? So she's Regan, but she never gets to go back to being normal. She's always going to be possessed pea soup Regan. And so the movie plays with us in what Andrew Tudor calls those positions of secure and paranoid horror. We feel like it's going to be a secure horror movie at the point where, Rachel was down the well and she looks up and there's light and we're like, yay, it's a happy ending. That's so nice. And some people are still sad that the horse died, but at least it's over. And the movie flat out says it's over. And they're like, oh, did you know how long you could live down in a well? 7 days. It all feels like closure. It all feels like closure. But we don't get secure horror with this movie. Psych! Another fake out. And then we get the insecure horror, the paranoid horror with which the movie ends. And Aiden, as he delivers that beautiful, beautiful line, what about the person we show it to? As they're making copies of the videotape to show to other people, because that's how you can pass along the problem. Whoa, do you feel it follows just around the corner? You can pass along the problem. What about the person we show it to? What happens to them? And then the film cuts to the video of the ring, and then static. And guess who they showed it to? Us! I love it. I absolutely love it. It's so good. And, and sure, if you stop to think about it for just a moment, it doesn't make any sense. But this movie didn't ask you to think about it. This movie asked you to feel a lot of things. And it did that through a number of techniques of film language. Absolutely, there are narrative elements that push us towards this, but I think that those are recognizable. We get those more obvious, I guess, narrative items, like the fact that, like a mother killing her child, that's horrible. The dead horses is horrible. The father electrocuting himself in the bathtub. These are all horrifying images. But then there's this other subtle level in which the film is just kind of scratching at us the whole way through with these camera techniques of rack focus, of closed framing, of masking, and the repetition of framing. I bring these things up because I want you to be thinking about them. Not only because, that's what I saw when I sat down to do a really close viewing of this movie, but also because I want you to be thinking about them as you look to next week and our final analytic film, I guess you'd say. We've only got 2 to go, and the next week is the last of the decades. So next week we get into the 2010s with It Follows, and it's a movie that is absolutely playing with focus, with camera work, with trying to get us as the viewer to look all over the frame to try to see where it is and whether or not it's following. So, until next week, stay creepy. That's a terrible way to end this episode, but that's all I've got. We'll see you soon.